Early in the course you were exposed to thinkers who felt that there was some method of determining the objectivity of ethics. You remember Plato had the ascent of the divided line, and supposedly by going up the divided line you attain finally the wisdom of the philosopher. And one of the hallmarks of the philosopher was a knowledge of good and evil. And I take it one is in no doubt in Plato's Republic that Plato's concept of justice is objectively superior to that of Thrasymachus. And Aristotle, again, you haven't had much of Aristotle, but Aristotle thought that there was a road to perfection in human nature, that human beings who followed that road were living an objectively superior life to people who deviated from that road. That is, a life of humane love and creative work. And Aquinas, of course, quite clearly thought there was objectivity in ethics. That is, he thought that we could use reason to find the eternal plan of the universe in the mind of God. And you remember, God did nothing in vain, which meant that we weren't to take human life. We were all God's creations. And anyone who took a human life was flying in the face of God. Nietzsche is a modern thinker of the 19th century, and he will present a stark contrast to the ancients and to the medieval thinkers. That is, he not only rejects the objectivity of good and evil, but he feels that conventional morality is corrupting. And you see this quite clearly in the book you've been assigned, Beyond Good and Evil. And it's worth reflecting for a moment what the word beyond means. That is, this is a work of advocacy, and it's directed to people who have the potential for greatness. And Nietzsche tells you to go beyond good and evil, and he means that in three senses. First, he means that there is a more fundamental value than moral goodness, and that is perfection value. And before you talk about good and evil, you have to rank creatures in terms of their perfection. And there's no doubt that Nietzsche thinks that there is a ladder of perfection, that supermen are in some sense more perfect than ordinary human beings, and they're more perfect than animals. And if you asked him what they're more perfect in regard, he would say creativity. That is, animals, I take it, are the slaves of instinct, are they not? And the ordinary person is a slave of conventional morality. But certain human beings are gigantic. That is, they are super people or supermen, and they are the ones who create. They create great cathedrals, great works of art, great literature, great poetry. And he will try to convince you that perfection value is more fundamental than morality, that before morality can get off the ground, you have to ask, who is perfect enough to be worthy of moral concern? Most of you don't think ants are perfect enough to be worthy of moral concern. You don't consider them high enough on the order of being. So that's one meaning of beyond, that there is a kind of value beyond morally good and morally evil that is more fundamental than moral values are. The second thing he's going to urge upon, at least those who have a potential for greatness, is that conventional morality is a mere weapon. It's something that weak people use to tame strong people. It's something that the mediocre masses use to disarm the great. So you're going to have to go beyond good and evil as conventionally defined. And then finally he says that if you look at the lives of great men, you find that they often toyed with evil, that they found doing what was conventionally evil actually added to their creativity. So you should actually play games with conventional morality. Not only shouldn't you take it seriously, but you can actually use it to encourage your creative mission. So there are three senses then in which we're to go beyond good and evil. Now let's reflect about these a bit. Why is Nietzsche so much against morality? Well, he feels that morality by its very nature has autonomy. We'll see what that means in a moment. And insofar as it has autonomy, it actually subordinates yourselves to the moral code. Now, there were other thinkers who thought that we ought to perfect human nature. In a way, Plato would agree that we have to ask what perfects human beings before we can put morality in perspective. But Plato thought that morality was a facet of becoming a perfect human being. In Plato's Republic, and in Plato's dialogues at least, you have the image of the chariot. And the driver of the chariot represents reason. And reason discovers what is perfect for human beings. And then you have the lead horse, which is trained to follow the directions of the driver. And you need that horse because it has to keep in line the wayward horse, which represents the passions. That is, the passions tempt you to live the life of a dilettante, to think nothing more of eating and drinking and sex and a life of casual pleasure. They tempt you to murder. And cool reason needs an ally. That is, reason alone could never conquer the powerful force of the passions. So once reason discovers what is good and evil, you have to train a part of your emotional life to love the good. And only when you have a part of you that we would call the conscience or your ego ideal, a sense of moral indignation, does reason have a passionate ally that would control the baser passions, your lusts. So Plato also has an image of human perfection. It's where reason discovers the good, a part of you is taught to love the good, and that love of the good is so powerful that you can actually live a good life rather than being subject to temptation. But note that love of the good, Plato means love of the morally right and the love of duty, the love of justice towards all. So in Plato's concept of perfection, you have a role for morality, a role for duty. Nietzsche is denying that. He's saying that that's a false road towards perfection. That true perfection means purging a sense of morality from your soul entirely. He says, after all, what is the essence of morality? Morality says moral goodness is trumps. You may be tempted to indulge yourself at the expense of a friend. Let's say you're at a party, and to draw attention to yourself, you're tempted to hold a friend up to ridicule. And what does morality says? Morality says that is absolutely wrong. That is, it's not a question of how much you desire to shine at the party. How powerful your passion is irrelevant. It must give way to duty, because if it is a wrong act to ridicule your friend, that trumps it. Morality offers no excuses. If you say an action that is wicked might be beautiful, morality says don't do it. If you say an action might be satisfying, morality says don't do it. In other words, morality makes a peculiar claim. It claims to stamp acts with a sort of value that takes precedence over all other categories of value. I mean, we do value the beautiful. We do value pleasure. We do value telling the truth even. But morality, if it stamps an act as morally wrong, it means it has a kind of wickedness that takes precedence over all other kinds of goodness in a qualitative way. It's not a matter of asking yourself, do I feel more dutiful, or do I feel more like humiliating my friend? That would be to merely throw morality in the scales to be followed insofar as it had a greater weight than the other forms of goodness. Morality actually holds the scales. It tells us what we can do and cannot do categorically. And when you stamp something as morally right, it means you ought to do it whether you want to or not, whether you find it elegant or beautiful to do it. So morality then enslaves the self, according to Nietzsche. That is, morality tells you that you must curb expressing your nature as a human individual because of the vetoes of the morally right and the morally wrong. So what is meant to be a part of you becomes your master. That is, the part of you that is your conscience is now the master over the total you. And if you have the opportunity, let's say, to create a great work of art, and in order to create that great work of art, you'd have to steal some money, well, morality says you ought not to do it. Nietzsche says that shows how moral autonomy becomes a dictator over the self. I mean, if you have the potential to become a great artist, that is what will perfect and realize your nature. And if morality says no, that just shows how destructive morality is of greatness. It leads you away from the path of perfection. So rather than making morality part of the perfect human being, as in Plato, the great human being must purge morality from their heart. Otherwise, you have a traitor in your bosom. You have a part of you that is going to give directions to the ego, that is, to the human being striving for perfection. So we have to reject the tyranny of ought. He says, up to now, Western civilization has given you three alternatives as to how to live. Some people like Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas have told you to be good. Some people like the Marquis de Sade told you to be evil. But he says, you know, just doing things that are forbidden is an adolescent type of life, you know, like rebelling against your parents. To be consistently evil so you'll be an enfant terrible, you'll be shocking, is no more destructive or no less destructive of perfection than being conventionally good. And then there are people who tell you to waste your life in an amoral hedonism. That is, you have no sense of a higher mission at all. You merely give in to whatever is the pleasure of the moment. He says, for the first time, I'm telling at least some human beings there's a fourth alternative. You need not be conventionally good. You need not be conventionally evil. You need not be a purposeless dilettante. You can express your own creative powers without moral restraint. So this, again, is a new way of living. Now, it's not for everyone, of course, because most people don't have the capacity to be creative. We'll get to them in a moment. Nietzsche calls them herdmen. It's only the great Shakespeare, Michelangelo, Raphael. These are the people to whom he is addressing himself. Now, this brings us to the ladder of being. Nietzsche is an ethical skeptic in a certain sense. And he says most of you make an assumption without ever verbalizing it and without ever seeing that it is arbitrary. Most of you would say, well, it's wrong not to treat human beings as worthy of moral concern. And Nietzsche would say that's only one of four alternatives, and there is no rational guide as to which alternative we should choose except taste. And he would say, you ignore the fact that there are people who tell you that they think even insects are a form of life that are significant enough to be in the circle of moral concern. I take it most of you who consider yourself to be good people mow your lawns without fear or favor, don't you? That is, you don't care about the grasshoppers or ants or grubs that you might grind up. He'd say, well, that means you don't consider them worthy of moral concern. But the Jainists, they draw a line that includes the ants. I take it Jainists walk around and sweep the path in front of them. So they won't step on insects. And they wear little masks, so they won't breathe in microbes. So they think any form of life is worthy of moral concern. They would consider you inhuman. And then there are the animal rights people. They don't usually care much about ants, but they care about cats and dogs and monkeys and don't think we perform medical experiments on them and so forth. So they draw the line of moral concern a little higher. They include mainly warm-blooded animals. And he would say, it's an arbitrary choice. Who's to say where you should draw this line of what sort of creature is perfect enough to be worthy of moral concern? Most humanists draw the line below human beings. That doesn't mean they think you ought to be cruel to animals, because cruelty is demeaning in a person. But animals don't have the same rights as human beings. They have only derivative status. That is, the reason that it's wrong to be cruel to animals, it's demeaning. What would you think of someone who sat around all day and took pleasure in tearing the wings off a fly? You'd think that that showed a debased personality. Well, anyone who is just cruel to animals for the sake of cruelty is the same type of debased human being. But animals don't have rights in the same thing as people do. We wouldn't experiment on people for medical reasons. But if the only way to get a cure for epilepsy is to experiment on rhesus monkeys, then it's allowable to do it. So while you would not be callous towards animals, you don't think about them as animal rights people do, as having the same type of moral status as a human. He says, I choose to regard herd people as you regard animals. There's a huge gulf between a Michelangelo or a Goethe or a Shakespeare and the ordinary person sitting in Northeast Valley watching a female impersonator on television. You know, the gap between a truly creative person and the ordinary person is enormous, as great as you think of the gap between a human being and an animal. And therefore, I draw the line of moral concern below Supermen. And I don't think that ordinary humans have rights. Supermen ought to give justice to one another because they are equals. They are all significant enough to count morally. And therefore, no Superman should deny the right of self-expression to another Superman. But their attitude towards ordinary people would be yours towards animals. That is, no Superman would be sadistic to ordinary people. That's ignoble and demeaning. But you have no rights in their eyes. And just as you would sacrifice an animal to a serious purpose, so Supermen have the right to sacrifice thousands of herdmen for a great artistic vision. That is, if you were in medieval times and wanted to build a great cathedral, and it required the lives of 1,000 peasants, well, you would use religion to manipulate them. You wouldn't believe in conventional religion, of course. But you would say, this is a great temple to God. And you would try and get them to feel they would go to heaven if they would risk their lives in building this cathedral. So you would manipulate them without any concern for their so-called well-being. They're not a significant enough form of life to count morally. So you'd use them as a means to a great end. Does everyone then understand what Nietzsche means when he says that perfection is more fundamental than moral value? Before you ask what it would be just to do to a person, you have to acknowledge them as being perfect enough to enter the circle of moral concern. And only when you decide where to draw this line does morality take root. So justice is appropriate between Supermen. And herdmen can give one another justice. But there is no justice between species. That is, herdmen have no obligations to Supermen and vice versa. If Supermen are worth their salt, however, they will manage to manipulate herdmen behind the scenes. That is, they will preach, spirituality from the pulpit to get you to sacrifice your life for the great cathedral. So that's, of course, they're using their superior intelligence to manipulate you towards great purposes. So there are really three propositions that we have to absorb about morality. And these three propositions are, first, who counts? That's the first thing, the basis of morality. Who enters the circle of moral concern? So ask yourself, who counts? Who is perfect enough to be worthy of moral concern? Secondly, if you're a Superman, recognize justice to other Supermen. But between species, between you and herdmen, morality is just a weapon. They, of course, will have a morality like Christianity. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the mediocre. Blessed are the people who have nothing to offer except their meekness and their good heart. And they will try to use that herd morality to tame the Superman, to make you feel guilty about your greatness. That is, they'll try and make you internalize their herd morality so that you won't sacrifice them to some great achievement. But that's mere weaponry. For a Superman to be seduced by that is a sign of weakness. You, of course, will use herd morality whenever you can to manipulate them to make them malleable and make them follow you. If you're a Napoleon, you'll give inspiring speeches so that Frenchmen will lay down their lives for the vision of the new Europe you want to create. You see then Nietzsche's fundamental moral philosophy, that the first question before morality even gets started is who is perfect enough to be a person of moral concern. Secondly, justice is appropriate between supermen because they are all creative equals. And finally, that herd morality is a mere weapon that the herd used to tame the great. And you should turn the tables on them. You should manipulate herd morality to make them malleable. And this is just a war. Ethics between species is merely a test of will. Any questions about all of that? Well then, let's go on to the next point. Nietzsche emphasizes in Beyond Good and Evil what I will call the collapse of metaphysics. And he says at one time you can understand people taking morally right and wrong seriously. For example, they believed in God. And if you believe in God and you believe that God implanted a soul in every person, well then you feel that everyone has moral status in the eyes of God, do you not? But he says most of us today are atheists. We don't believe in God. And yet we go on looking at morality through religious eyes, like a cultural lag. You know, it would be as if you no longer thought it was wicked to dance on Sunday, but for some reason just went on never dancing on Sunday. You'd say, what's the matter with you? Haven't you grown up? You know, maybe when you're a little child you thought it was wicked to dance on Sunday because your parents were strict Presbyterians. But you're now behaving morally as if you still believe something that no mature person believes. So he says no intellectually mature person still believes in God, and no one with good taste could actually see anything inspiring in ordinary people. And yet you have people like John Stuart Mill talking about the greatest good of the greatest number. That is, even though they don't believe in the soul, even though they don't believe that these people are precious in the sight of God, they still go on treating them morally as significant. And he says, what does that mean? It means that you have not rendered consistent your philosophy. That is, you're still treating ethics as if God existed, even though you no longer believe in God. You no longer believe in the soil in which this ethics grew. So he'd say, do you still believe in Plato's doctrine of forms? Do you believe there's a world of essences up there and we ascend the dialectic and we read what's good and evil in the world of forms? Of course not. Today we believe in the physical universe. We don't believe in transcendental entities like God and the world of forms. And you have, in other words, a metaphysical residue in your minds that you ought to purge if you have any self-respect. That is, rather than believing in the kind of morality that makes sense only if you are a religious believer, you should believe in the kind of morality that makes sense if you're, let's say, a physicalist, someone who believes that only the physical world exists. So that then is one of the props of Nietzsche's view. That is that morality has become a sort of museum piece to hold over from the past that should have disappeared and has not. Now, the collapse of metaphysics up to Nietzsche's time was gradual. That is, first you had thinkers like Locke, and they said, well, here we have a sentence, let's say a lamp. And we say the lamp is yellow. And he says that implies that there's something called the thing in itself, the lamp, which possesses the attribute yellowness. And of course, Christians would say there is a part of you called the soul, And the soul possesses your mind, the soul possesses your body. It's something beyond physical experience, but it's real. And Locke was the first, according to Nietzsche, who started the slide of metaphysics downhill. Not that Locke wasn't a believing Christian. He didn't carry it all the way. But Locke said, look, we know that colors are just subjective. That is, when you say the lamp is yellow, all you mean is that it reflects a certain wavelength of light, isn't it? So there's no yellowness in the lamp that's out there. The yellowness is just your eye's reaction to certain wavelengths of light. And he called these secondary qualities. They weren't real. They were just a product of the human imagination or sensory apparatus. And he said, all we can say about substances, that is what's really out there, is that they have weight and we can't walk through them. You know, we have no notion of what they're like, except they're heavy. You know, if we try to pick them up, they're heavy, and I can't walk through this space. So all we can say about the real world beyond human experience is that it has weight and it has mass. Well, you can see what he meant by that. That is, if you take a Newtonian vision of the world, you are actually mainly space with lots of atoms, aren't you? And the atoms are thick enough in your immediate vicinity that I can't walk through you. But it's crazy to say that you in yourself have red hair. You just have a sort of atomic composition in your head that reflects a certain wavelength of light, aren't you? Does it make any sense if a tree falls over in the desert to say that there is noise if no one is there to hear it? Well, there's sound, because when the tree falls over it makes sound waves in the atmosphere, doesn't it? But if there's no ear there, there is no noise. There are just vibrations in the atmosphere. So that was the first step. The next step went a bit further, and that was Kant. Kant said, look, how do we know that the real world has even mass or structure or weight? He said, we're really like you're in a 3D movie theater. And have any of you ever seen a 3D film? And I take it you have to put on the little spectacles, don't you? And if you take the spectacles off, you just see a flat screen out of focus with wavy lines. But when you put the spectacles on, you see it clearer and in 3 dimensions, don't you? And Kant said, for all we know, the thing in itself is totally different than anything we can imagine, because we have spectacles on through which we see it. We first have space-time spectacles. When you have on your 3D spectacles, everything looks in 3 dimensions, doesn't it? But when you take them off, you see the screen is really 2-dimensional, don't you? Well, how do you know if the spectacles are welded on how many dimensions the thing in itself would have? It could have 60 dimensions. It could have 0 dimensions. You see it 3-dimensionally because you have the spectacles on. In the movie theater, you can take them off and you can see what the screen in itself looks like when not structured by your spectacles. But human beings, we can't take off our perceptual apparatus. We don't even know that the real world, has 3 dimensions. It could have 1, it could have 15, it could have none. So it's not just colors that are subjective. We can literally say nothing whatsoever about the real world. It's all a world of appearance. And then Hume took the final step. He said, how do we know that the thing in itself even exists? Wouldn't we do better to just think of ourselves as sequences of experiences? And we try to find some unity in those sequences of experiences, no doubt. But to talk about something real existing beyond our empirical universe is absurd. After all, if you see a mirage in the desert, what that really means is a prediction. If you see an oasis, which is not a real oasis, you don't run forward and punch through the world you experience and put a hole in it and find that there's either a real or a non-real oasis there, do you? You run forward and you think, well, if it's a real oasis and I scoop up, I'll get a mouthful of water. If it's a mirage, I'll get a mouthful of sand, won't you? And both of this are just experiences. You either experience drinking water or trying to drink sand. So to say that the sense experience is deceptive or a mirage, you never really refer to this mysterious thing in itself, do you? You just make a prediction about your own future experience. And if the percept is reliable, then the prediction is validated. If the percept is unreliable, then the prediction is falsified, isn't it? So you never move outside the world of empirical experience. You have the impression that someone will say, oh, a mirage oasis isn't really there. Well, a true oasis really is there. Well, what's the cash value of that? That is, how do we punch a hole through experience and stick our head through the screen and see what's really there? We don't. If we have a veridical sense experience, our predictions are validated. If we have a non-veridical or hallucinatory experience, then our predictions are frustrated. And Kant says, Nietzsche says, certainly this is good reason to ignore all metaphysical concepts in ethics. I mean, if you don't think the material world is really out there, what about believing that really out there are gods and angels and Plato's forms? If materialistic metaphysics is absurd, what about idealistic metaphysics? You know, if you can't even posit the real existence of material objects, does it make sense to posit the real existence of gnomes and fairies and angels and elves and gods? That is, things that aren't even supposed to be material objects, but to be mysterious immaterial objects. Ayer once put this point, as we'll say, and he would say, what is the cash value of saying you believe in an immaterial entity? If someone says there's an invisible immaterial leprechaun dancing on this podium, and I say to them, well, why can't I see it? They'll say, well, I told you it was invisible. And then if you say, well, why can't I feel it? They'll say, well, I told you it was immaterial. And you now realize that that is equivalent to saying that there's no leprechaun there at all, isn't it? That is, there is no cash value in talking about an invisible, immaterial thing. You might just as well say it doesn't exist, because in terms over here.
So what's the difference then between, say, morality and beauty? I mean, how does beauty then have any more...
Beauty never claims to exist in the same way as a god. I mean, beauty is appreciation in a human mind. And we are now trapped in the world of experience, aren't we? And Nietzsche thinks that the highest form of experience you can have is the apprehension of having created something beautiful, or the appreciation. So merely because we're trapped in our world of experience doesn't mean there can't be a hierarchy of human experiences. Now, of course, the hierarchy, he would say, I can't give you any reason why a great painting is better than the trail a slug leaves. You know, they're both part of your experience. But if you have good taste, you'll prefer the Sistine Chapel to the trail of a slug. But again, he would say, now you are beginning to think as I do. You're beginning to see that so-called ethics has to be purely empirical. Rather than grounding duties to one another because we believe in a God that will judge us after death, we have to say, discovering what perfects human nature is a no-holds-barred experiment with life. You know, we don't go beyond the experience of living human beings.
But then he also says that physics is invalid because even though that's based on empiricism, it's just on our experience of...
It's invalid if it degenerates into scientism. That isn't a word Nietzsche uses. That is, physics is perfectly valid because it helps us predict human experiences. But if you think physics tells us what's really out there beyond human experience, you've lapsed into metaphysical thinking. That is, Einstein's physics was better than Newton's physics because he gave us better predictions about where we would find the heavenly bodies if we look at them through telescopes, didn't he? But if you think that the world is really made out of little balls because that was one of Newton's concepts, then you're in the position of the village atheist. There's one very funny passage in Nietzsche where he says the village atheist gave up worshiping God to worship rocks. And what he means by that many of the village atheists were materialists. They believed in a really existing material universe made of little billiard balls that was beyond human experience. And he says, this is not quite as stupid a metaphysics as believing in gods and fairies and angels, but it's still metaphysics. It doesn't have the perspective that a modern person should. That we are trapped in a world of experience, and it's up to us to make the most of our experiences. And the preeminent experience you can have is the thrill of creativity. I mean, of having painted a great painting. And if you can't have that, you can at least have the taste to thrill to the fact that someone else has achieved a great painting. And if you don't have that, you'll probably sit at home and watch a female impersonator on television. And at that point, you drop below the level of moral concern, don't you? I mean, you no longer have the type of human potential that, from Nietzsche's point of view, makes you worthy of moral regard. And if you say to him, isn't that arbitrary? He will say, well, it's perfectly arbitrary where you draw the line. You know, under ordinary human beings. If it's arbitrary, it's arbitrary. And he would just say, I'm not trying to sneak in the objectivity of ethics again. I'm merely telling the great that they are fools if they are seduced by the herd morality of the masses. Herd morality is appropriate to the masses, but it's hardly appropriate to someone with the potential to be great. You see what Nietzsche is saying, that we suffer from a metaphysical hangover. We don't believe in God or the soul anymore, and yet we believe that every human being is intrinsically valuable, as if we were going to say, that's because they are valuable in the sight of God. But there's no God. Why don't we grow up? We should have a purely empirical ethics. And if you're a person of great talent, you should say to yourself, what seems to me to fulfill my great talent? And if that is creativity, you don't sacrifice creativity to conventional morality. You say, that's for herd men. Maybe that's what gives them their greatest sense of well-being. They're herd creatures. They're never happier than when singing, what are these songs they sing now in pubs? What do they call it? Karaoke, isn't it? Yes, they're never happier. They can sit around and sing karaoke, and that's about all they're capable of. You're capable of decorating the Sistine Chapel. Why identify with them? Now, of course, another thing that Nietzsche points out is that he thinks bad philosophy creates false problems. And one of the things that disturbs him is people who believe the will is determined. Because he thinks that if you believe the will is determined, you have a new master, don't you? Fate, that robs you of individual expression. I mean, it's bad to take duty too seriously because you'll compromise your creativity on the altar of duty, and it becomes an autonomous ruler that turns you into a slave. But what about the question of determinism? He would say, no one knows from human experience what the human will is capable of. When people talk about determinism, they're sneaking metaphysics back in. And he gives the example of Descartes. Descartes thought that your body was a material substance and your mind was an immaterial substance. And that, of course, creates a so-called philosophical problem. You can imagine how a material billiard ball can move another by hitting it, can't you? But how could an immaterial billiard ball move a material one? It has no weight. So he says, Descartes, therefore, gets into a dilemma. He says, here I have a purely mental event. I decide to raise my arm. And then miraculously, the arm goes up. But how did the immaterial billiard ball knock the material one into motion? Did any of you ever see the cartoons of Casper, the cartoon ghost? And these are pretty boring, aren't they? They have just one joke, namely, Castor being immaterial can't grab a hold of anything, can he? Well, from Descartes' point of view, the mind, how could something purely immaterial move something material? And Descartes' solution was that every time you moved your hand, God performed a miracle. That is, God is sort of like a giant switchboard operator. And when you decide to move your arm, your immaterial thought can't actually raise your material arm, but God plugs in the connection. Of course, as Voltaire pointed out, this makes God an accomplice to every murder, doesn't it? We talked about this a bit under Aquinas. And then Malebranche came along, Leibniz came along with the two clocks theory. And he said there was no causal interaction between your mind and body. It was just that from all eternity, your mind had been wound up to decide to move your arm at this moment, and your body had been wound up in coordination. So your hand moves at just the right moment. It's as if you had one clock that was timed to strike just before another. You might then think that the striking of the first clock had caused the striking of the second, might you not? But it's actually just a coincidence of timing, isn't it? And of course, Malebranche was a Catholic priest, and he pointed out that the Leibnizian system, of course, again robs us of free will, doesn't it? It means that you're just a clock that's wound up from all eternity. And Nietzsche says, for heaven's sake, this is all nonsense. The dilemma of free will comes from thinking that you are a combination of two substances, material substance and immaterial substance. Every one of you experiences raising your arm. As an experiencing creature, part of your ability is to have an act of will that you're going to slap this rostrum, and then you slap it. And he would say, once you get rid of the notions of material and immaterial substance, what's the problem? We all know that by an act of will, we can manipulate our bodies. It's just that simple. Why do we get tied up in knots on an issue of this sort? And he says, I'm not even much interested in free will versus determinism. I'm interested in strong wills versus weak wills. There are weak-willed people who don't have the guts to seek perfection in the face of conventional morality, and there are strong-willed people who have the courage to do so. And if you truly shed metaphysics, you no longer classify wills as free or unfree. You classify them as either strong or weak. That's the way an empiricist would do it. And to tell me that when I defy conventional morality to sacrifice the lives of peasants to build a great cathedral, that I was determined to do it, I will merely say to you, what cash value does that have? That is, I have no awareness of some billiard ball knocking me towards a certain action than another. As a choosing creature, I have the illusion of freedom. And when you second guess the experience of freedom, you're always bringing in a metaphysical category. That is, you're starting to reason metaphysically. So let's forget about the so-called philosophical dilemma of free will versus determinism. Let's focus on what the experiencing human being experiences. You either build a strong will or you lapse into a weakness of will. And he doesn't care which herdmen choose to do. He has no sympathy with the Marquis de Sade, who develops a strong will to always do what is conventionally evil, because Marquis de Sade had no potential for greatness anyway. But he cares what choice Superman makes. He says, if it makes you feel stronger to believe in free will, believe in free will. But it's not necessary. I think there's a word of truth in what Nietzsche says. I think, as someone who is a physicalist and think that only the physical universe exists, and who follows the scientific method, I don't think science has settled yet whether we're free or determined. That is, just as evolution produced living matter from non-living and conscious life from non-conscious living life, and conscious life with a sense of self-identity from conscious life that has no sense of self-identity. That is, if a dog looks into a mirror, it thinks it's seeing another dog. If a chimpanzee looks in a mirror, it realizes it's seeing a unique individual. If there's a feather or something on their fur, they'll brush it away and look in the mirror to see if the feather has disappeared. That is, they have an awareness of self. And it could be that we are a kind of conscious creature with a sense of self in which the self has the capacity to make truly free choices. There's nothing irrational about that. You may well have an ability. Your present self may have the capacity to actually choose this rather than that. That's certainly how it feels, isn't it? I mean, if you're trying to decide whether to go to an escapist film or visit a friend in the hospital, you will sit and wait forever for a billiard ball to knock you in one direction or the other. You have the feeling that you must decide, don't you? That you have to make an autonomous choice between two alternatives, either of which is open to you. I mean, that's how it feels, doesn't it? And I have no reason to think that that feeling is deceptive without scientific proof. If a scientist could ever make up a machine that read my brain waves so he could predict every choice I would make before I made it, well, then I would have evidence that I was laboring under a delusion, wouldn't I? But we have no notion as to whether science will ever do that. It may be that scientists, as empirical science gets better, will be able to predict most of my behavior, but there will always be a little circle of choice that they can't predict, namely where I stew over a moral decision, that is, whether to visit my friend or not. So we don't know, but you all have to choose, don't you? That is, when a friend slaps you, you either have to feel moral indignation because they were an autonomous agent, or you have to say, that's silly, I wouldn't slap a rock that had fallen on my face, because rocks have no free will. So we're in the position where we have to make perhaps what is called an existential choice. That is, without rational guidance, you have to just choose whether you feel that your appearance of autonomy is based on reality or whether it's deceptive. Over here.
Wouldn't that choice purely be a product of causality, though?
Well, that of course is assuming what you're trying to prove. If all choices are a product of causality, then the choice whether to regard yourself as free or determined would be obviously, but you're not playing the game. You're saying it is inconceivable that human evolution could have created a conscious creature with an awareness of self whose present self really can make autonomous decisions. And that seems to me a factual proposition that has to be tested scientifically on its merits. Now, you've hit on an important point. If belief in free will is valid, science will never be able to explain all human behavior. And of course, if you're a scientist, you don't like that, do you? That is, if you're a psychologist, you automatically almost become a determinist. Because if it is true, there are limits to the ability of psychology to handle human behavior. But no scientist has ever verified the proposition, science is capable of explaining all human behavior. That is, to my mind, still an open question. Maybe it'll happen someday, and then we'll all have reason to be determinists. Maybe we will find that increasingly science seems to be hitting a barrier when it tries to intrude into a certain area of decision-making. Then we'll begin to think, free will might be true. But at present, we just don't know. And yet we're in the uncomfortable position that you either have to treat your intimates as autonomous human beings, where you may feel moral indignation. You might say, well, I thought you're a better friend than that, and that was a disloyal thing to choose to do. Well, you would have a very different attitude towards a human being than a dog, wouldn't you? I mean, if your dog began to pay more attention to your neighbor than to you, you wouldn't have the same sense of moral indignation if your spouse slept with your neighbor, would you? That is, you would think that one was just an animal following instincts and the other was an autonomous human being. Now, it could be that your spouse is no different than the animal, that they may be driven by unconscious drives and have no autonomy. But we don't know, do we? So we, in a sense, Nietzsche is correct. The choice between freedom and determinism is an unstructured choice. It's a choice that we can find no rational warrant for choosing one way or another. And he says, if you feel you've got to choose, any Superman would choose free will. That is the notion that they're a godlike person who has escaped the bonds of causality. Any questions about Nietzsche thus far? I see we're running out of time. And next time we'll go into Nietzsche's ideal of the Superman. Over here.
What decides who is a Superman and who is a herdsman?
Well, that of course is an interesting question because some people are deluded into thinking they have great creativity who don't. That is, there are people in Greenwich Village who think they're Supermen because they paint themselves blue and roll across a canvas and call it great art, aren't they? So it may be difficult for the individual to decide. Nietzsche would say, if you are not infantile, eventually you realize that there are limits, that when you paint, there's just no greatness there. Did any of you see the series on television, Brideshead Revisited? And in it, one of the chief characters takes to painting and tries, and at the end he thinks, there's nothing alive here. You know, he goes to the tropics, he paints parrots, rather than just Englishmen having tea, and he eventually decides, I don't have it. And then you know, don't you? But at least he had the good taste to appreciate the great. Well then, next time we'll continue with Nietzsche.